I was born in Winnsboro, South Carolina, which is just north of Columbia. And it's a very old town to be in that part of the state. But let's see, it was founded in 1777 at the same time as Mount Zion Institute, which was a school for boys from Charleston. They didn't want them to get malaria and yellow fever. And in those days, I read somewhere that they thought it was the morning mist that came up, and they called it the miasma. And they sent their sons up to the upcountry to get them out of the miasma, so they didn't get it. I think that's kind of interesting. And of course it was there, and in a year or two, Cornwallis got down our way, and that's where he spent his last winter in the Revolution. And I went to school at Mount Zion on the campus where Cornwallis packed up, moved north, and surrendered. So it made us very aware of the Revolution. But it's an easy thing to learn history if you're living or going to school where it occurred. But actually, according to some of the letters and things, Cornwallis was a gentleman. Because he was going to kill anybody that was against him. But unlike Tarleton, who just enjoyed killing people and therefore was named Bloody, Cornwallis was very polite to all the people there. And he named Fairfield County. He was riding out, it was in Old Camden District, he was riding out with some of his men and said, "What fair fields." And so Fairfield County is named that now, has been ever since. And that's about the only thing the town's really known for. But we went to school there. The school burned when I was in high school. And now it's no longer in use as a school, but it was probably the strangest school government you can imagine. Half of the schools still belong to the Mount Zion Society, and half of it belonged to the state of South Carolina. Now, I've never heard any other school like that, have you? And I just think it's odd. But anyway, I was born and reared there, and I was very uninteresting because I was neither poor nor rich, nor anything but just ordinary, middle class. And my parents lived there, of course, and my grandmother lived 2 blocks up the road. It was a long way if you went to Main Street, but it was 2 blocks the back way, so we could walk up there even when we were little children. And she had a great big yard. Our house was small and comfortable, but her house was left over. And it was, you know, the white pillows and the whole mess. And you can't afford to run a house like that in hard times. So a lot of things kind of slid, but we had a good time. We had a jogging board in the yard and many, many trees to climb, and I loved that. And I just had a nice, normal childhood. And of course we went to school when, well, I went to kindergarten, and then I went to school at 6, or 5, wasn't quite 6. And went to the same school 11 years. Now you all go 12, everybody goes 12, but the state was so poor, they couldn't afford to buy books. So we bought our own books. That's why I got this out to show you, because I don't think most people know that that was true. It's so long ago. Geometry is the only math I ever did halfway well. I'm just not a mathematician. But the price of that book, I thought a hardcover was kind of interesting. Is it 87 or 89 cents? 89. I'm named for my mother, who was Stacia Anslie Phillips, and she was named for her aunt, and she was named for her aunt. And I don't know who put it together, but back there somewhere over in Albertville County. My father's folks had been in Winnsboro since the first one got here. He was a Scottish minister. We were Associate Reformed Presbyterians, which just means that they didn't like having the government in their religion, even in Scotland when the king was head of it. And then everybody was there from then on. His father was a merchant, and his father was a merchant, but he was a Confederate veteran, and he was, son, I don't mean father, was wounded and captured. And now this was not deliberate, because the soldiers from the north got sick too, but they somehow got poisoned corn, bad corn, and he never really got well from that. So his son had, people in those days did not go into bankruptcy if they could help it. And I'm told, I did not get to know him, he died before I was born, but my grandfather was very young, but he went to New York and talked to all the people his father owed money to. And he said, it may take me the rest of my life, but I will pay you off. And so they trusted him and let him have some more credit. And he made a success of it. And later he was mayor and then state senator from home. And my mother was a minister's daughter. Daddy only went to one get-together after he graduated. And that time my mother was there, and he met her and decided he was going to marry her. And it took him a long time. She wasn't that crazy about the idea, apparently. And he had grown up in the dry goods. They called it dry goods then. And Daddy hated it, so he sold that and went into lumber and brick and all that stuff in a hardware company. And he built houses. He'd studied architecture, but he said in those days everybody was so poor that tried to live in a small town and build houses as an architect. We'd have starved, so he practiced contracting. And we had a very happy life, I think, although he had a crushed shoulder and died of cancer, but he was the first person most people in my hometown ever met who had cancer and got over it. And he lived 15 more years, which in 43, when he had it, was unheard of. And his doctor, surgeon in Philadelphia, he said, what can I do? I don't have the money to build a new hospital or anything like that. He said, I don't want a new hospital. Please tell people you had cancer so they'll come and get help and we can save them. And people would come and ask him, just come up. He'd be sitting on the porch and say, did you really have cancer and get over it? And he'd say, yes. Be sure to go to the doctor now. We come down here sometime in the summer at Paulie's. And we also went to Montreat, North Carolina, in the mountains, every summer, because my mother's father, who, as I said, was a minister, had to live in Manses. And so he bought a house in the mountains so he could own a home. And so we went up there every summer for a little while. And we weren't hungry. We didn't have a lot. As my aunt said, everybody had church clothes, school clothes, and home clothes. You changed your clothes when you came home to save your good clothes. Now that sounds funny now, but that really it was typical. If you were lucky. If you weren't lucky, you wore whatever you could get. I went to school with a lot of people whose only shoes were tennis shoes, and they wore those only in cold weather. And tennis shoes in those days cost $1. If that sounds impossible, it's still true. And lots of people didn't have coats. I used to worry about it, but there was nothing anybody could do except just try. But the worst thing was, looking back, there was no welfare, there was no Social Security, there was no stamps for people who didn't have anything to eat. If you couldn't get something at a church or other place that gave things away, you just went hungry. And I hate thinking about that even right now. It just makes you sort of sick. But one of the nicest things that's happened to me in a long time, I had in my grade a girl whose family farmed, and she didn't have a coat. She had a lot of sweaters and things, and she did well in school. She always was clean. She always came to school. It was just really good, because they started having school buses about that time. And one day, 20 years ago, I guess, I went in the post office in Winnsboro, and there was this real good-looking lady down at the end of the room in an elegant outfit. And I didn't recognize her, and went on and did my business, and I started out, and she said, aren't you going to speak to me, Anslie? And I went down and saw who it was, and I said, Liza, you look wonderful. And she said her husband had worked for my father before he went into World War II. And Daddy said he was real smart. When he came out, the GI Bill made it possible for him to go to school, and he got a college degree and graduated in engineering and moved to Coral Gables, Florida, just as a housing boom hit. So they were millionaires. And I don't know how you feel, but I just love that when people had it so hard and so poor and ended up that way. But she said, oh, we ruined our children. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, you know, we were so poor. We've given them everything they wanted. And I said, I don't think that would ruin them. It might make them a little selfish, but it didn't ruin them. But I could see her thinking, everything had been so hard. She earned everything, and her husband did too. And now their children didn't have to earn anything. They just put them through school. looking back, I'm sure he did. I wasn't aware of it. But he evidently did all right because I remember, children are so weird in some ways. I said, Daddy, the so-and-sos have 2 cars, and usually they're new, and we just have 1. Why can't we have 2 cars? And he said, darling, we are very fortunate to have 1 car, and these are my high-earning years, and I have to put up money for when you go to college and your sister goes to college, and And I thought, well, that's peculiar. I thought we just had money. You just didn't know. And another time, the only place in town that sold Eskimo bars, which do they still exist? I don't even know. But I loved them. And they cost a whole dime. And I was walking with Daddy, and I said, Daddy, I would love to have an Eskimo bar, please. And he said, well, darn, I don't happen to have any money with me right now. And I said, well, you could charge it. And he said, that just means you have to pay for it later. And I was just astonished. I didn't realize that when you charged it, it didn't go away. And he said, now, remember, anything you charge, you need to have the money to pay for before you charge it, because you got to pay it. And I was just amazed. I thought that was so odd. And now I think it's a pity everybody didn't bump into that. Because what are we going to do for people who've gotten themselves in debt before they're old enough to work? I do not remember food lines. I would not have been where they were, I expect. But I remember Winnsboro mills grew and grew, and it was a lifesaver to a great many people. They made tire cords for Uniroyal. And people who'd been on farms, who lost their farms, came in and worked in the mills. And that saved a lot of people, because from being hungry, they had a job. It was a tough job. It wasn't much fun for them, but at least the mill supplied them with a house and a job. And that meant they could eat. And I think that we didn't go to school when we were little, so I don't know what that was like. They had a mill school. But we all went to school, high school. And they had more money than a lot of people that worked other places. It was strange. There was always a sort of split between the town, the farmers, and the town people, which is the silliest thing you can think of when you look back. But people are weird. All of us are weird in some ways, I think. Winnsboro is just a little town, but it had, at that time, the oldest striking clock in the United States. And a lady from New England on a bus told me that one time. It had wooden works. And I didn't even know you could make wooden clockworks, but a lot of European clocks had them. And our town was laid out the English way. This street, that street. That was Congress, and this was Washington. And there was a Confederate monument bang in the middle of the crossing, which my grandfather, I think, got put up. And his son, my uncle, who was the editor of the little weekly, got taken down after much campaign, because he said if an oil truck drove into that at night, because the man was sleepy or something, it'd blow up the whole center of town and kill people. So they put it on the school grounds, and I think that was very sensible. We were accused of not being good UDC members. I never was one. But one lady said, "You're not loyal to the Confederacy." And my feeling has always been, as my father said, we honestly fought what we believed in. We lost. And it's time to stop, pick up the pieces, and start fresh. And I do think that. I'm proud of our ancestors, but I don't want us to go back to being, I'm mad at everybody but us, so that doesn't agree with me, which is what we seem to be turning into. I went to Erskine College for a year. That's over in Due West, South Carolina. And it was a great year, but I wanted to take things they didn't have, so I moved to the university. And the war broke out, in December. I went in September, wasn't that right? Yeah. And so we hurried up and got through. I got through in 3 years in the summer altogether. And then I went to Washington to work for J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. Now that is a job. I was training high school graduates to, brand new, just out of high school, to file J. Edgar Hoover's way. And I do assure you it was not simple to teach somebody. He had the most complicated numerical filing system you can possibly think of. And you had to swear that you'd never talk about it, and so I won't, but it was not easy. And I was 20 when I got there, and 21 by the time I left, which was at the end of the war. But it was a very interesting year to be in Washington. Roosevelt died. Eisenhower came home. There were big parades for all these things. Everybody was worn out with the war. And there were 6 of us in one apartment, with 2 bedrooms and 1 bath. When I think about that, I have the horrors, but we managed. Everybody managed, you had to. And so one of our roommates had a very hush-hush job. The department she worked for didn't even have a name. We knew it existed, but we didn't know what it did. They were counter-espionage agents is what they were. And she worked all night the night before the war was over in Europe. And so we thought the war was over, because it was, as far as the powers that be were regarded. But they didn't announce it till the next day. So we all celebrated, all 6 of us, with a real good dinner that we cooked, and then walked down to the Capitol, which was about 10 or 12 blocks. And because Washington had been blacked out. We even had gas mask training, which is awful. But all the lights were on. And I don't think I ever saw anything as beautiful, because it's just the idea that you can turn your lights on and go where you please, and And as we were walking up the walk to the Capitol, a group of girls came along singing "When the Lights Go On Again." And I've never forgotten that, because it was so appropriate. Because the war wasn't over. The Japanese still had to be done. And I do want to say something that seems to have gotten lost. The Japanese were offered the chance to surrender. And the emperor's people said they would fight to the last man. Well, that would have meant thousands of Americans would have been killed unnecessarily because they couldn't win. The Navy was gone, like ours had been after they hit us. Their troops were scattered in a lot of cases, and of course, at that point, we were fighting our way across the Pacific. And they said, look, you've lost, why don't you surrender? Japan never surrendered. Nippon never surrenders. So Truman had become president, of course, and he, I understand, debated a long time because of the atomic bomb. They really didn't know what it would do. If you're honest, I talked to somebody much later who worked on it, and he said nobody knew what it would do. It was something, you know, it's scary to think about. But they dropped it, and the Japanese still refused to surrender. So they dropped the second one. And at that point, they realized they were going to be pounded to death, I guess. But there's a lot of criticism now about our dropping it. But it saved thousands of lives, even though it killed a lot of people. And I wish we hadn't had to have it. But we know now that the Germans were within a few months of getting it when they had to surrender. And I remember talking to a friend who was a paratrooper officer in the Battle of the Bulge, and he said they got within 24 hours of our supplies. Nobody tells you that now, but he said that had they gotten through, they could have fought on for another year or two. And it took 3 paratroop drops, 3 different units, 2 American and 1 British in between the 2 Americans, before they could stop them. That time they fired till their machine guns were hot, too hot to touch. And he said one of theirs just curled over like it was a piece of bread or something. He said just awful. They were just piled up dead, the Germans. And when they went to bury them, 2/3 of them weren't dead. The SS troops, secret police in Germany, were their officers. They dragged in kids as young as 14 and men as old as 45 or 50 to keep fighting. They were running out of troops. And they told them that they'd shoot them in the back. So they ran forward and were smart enough to fall down, and like they were dead. So when they got everybody sorted out, sent the people that had to go to the hospital. By the way, I was lucky enough to have a friend who was the nurse in charge of the first hospital train that landed in Europe on D-Day +1. And she told me something I think ought to be broadcast. She said that they had conscientious objectors as medics. And she said, I was so proud of them. She said even when the Germans were bombing our train, they never neglected a single German prisoner who was on there, as well as, of course, the Americans. But she said it must have been terrifying, it was for her. But they never stopped doing what they needed for the wounded. And I like to think of that. Because a lot of people, I think conscientious objectors just are cowards or something, but they're not. And she said nobody will ever know what a good job they did. But they were on a train going across Europe, picking up the wounded. I don't think I'd have enjoyed that either. But anyway, they succeeded, and they saved a lot of lives, I'm sure. The guy I was telling you about from the Battle of the Bulge, told me something that still shocks me. He said one of their captives was not hurt. He was 14 years old. Good, tall boy, but that age. He was so hungry, he was almost fainting. But he wouldn't eat anything because he'd been taught that the Americans would poison him. So Tom said he had a sergeant from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who spoke German as well as English. And so he asked him to take the boy, and they sat down, and he put, I think on a log, and he put a big bar of chocolate between them. And he said, now you can take a piece of either side you want, and then you watch me eat from the other side. So they did that, and he said when the boy watched this guy until he was sure he wasn't going to die, and said, "You never seen food in hell so fast in your life." And he said there were a lot of those cases. They just were kids, just, you know. And I never realized that till after the war, and somebody told me, you don't know who you're fighting. But I wish we could quit fighting anybody. Daddy had had cancer, as I said, so I went home and ran his office for 3 years. And then he said, now you've always wanted to be a journalist, so you've earned it. And I went to the University of Arizona for journalism for a year, and that was great. Had a wonderful time. I thought I'd be older than everybody in school. And I was just about the same age as all the GI Bills, so it was great fun. A lot of social life, a lot of, you know, everybody was so relieved after the war. It's hard to realize, think back now. But there was one thing about that war that we all ought to feel grateful for then. Not, y'all, you don't have it. But everybody was on the same side. We were all pulling for the same thing, and no matter what your feelings were, you were together. And that's a wonderful feeling in a country. We haven't had it since, but at least we had it. After my father died, I went home for a while, and then I was offered a job in public relations, and I did that there for 14 months. And Southern Railway was one of our clients. And at the end of that 14 months, they were nice enough to offer me a job in public relations in Washington. And I must say that's a great deal of fun. It's hard work. I don't mean to pretend that you sail through, you don't. But if you do your job, it's a very pleasant job. And coming from newspapers, it was a big relaxation. But, and I miss trains. I wish we had lots of trains still. I had the good luck to get to go first class everywhere, and that's kind of nice. And then the last 10 years I worked, of the 25, there weren't any trains anymore. You flew everywhere. Not half as much fun. And now it's downright unpleasant. I just hate that they've done that to air travel. There's so many good things that have happened, but there's some bad things that have happened that let you have a more relaxed time of it. When you're on the train, you can walk around, you can eat, you can sleep, you know. After I retired, I asked several times when I had to go to California on a meeting or something, if I could take the train one time across Amtrak. And they said, oh no, we can't spare that time. So you flew each time. So when I retired, I went across right under Canada, that last line. And that is a beautiful trip if you get the chance. And when you get to what they call Big Sky Country, it doesn't look a thing like here. It's just so open and beautiful. And this is a gorgeous country. I've been across most of it, not all at once, but at different times. And by train and by plane, and part of the way by car. Oh yeah, always. And but I met more, really, when I was a newspaper woman than I did for the railroad. I had a whole day with Billy Graham and his wife one time in Montreat. And they're delightful people to just know, plus all they accomplish. But I mean, just as people, they're just delightful. And I guess the most interesting person I ever met was Eleanor Roosevelt. When she was senior representative to the United Nations, I was on the Charlotte Observer, and she was in Charlotte, and I went. She had 2 press conferences, and we were real lucky. Everybody went to the morning press conference, but Case Gary on the Charlotte Observer and I. And we went, and we had the whole hour because she was black, and she was delightful. But she was tall. I was 5'7.5" then, and I had on 3-inch heels, and I still looked up to her, so I know she was tall. But one of the cutest things I thought she said, when she said, one of the things you have to decide when you represent this country to the United Nations is how you will behave in their country. And she said that she knew she could not crawl around on the floor like the Thai people do. By their own choice, I was told by somebody from Thailand. But anyway, she said, I told her she was. And she said there was also the fact that we don't kowtow to anybody, really. So she decided. She went with a hand out and said, Your Majesty, I am so delighted to meet the only king ever born in the United States. And he thought that was perfectly delightful and said, come and sit down. And they had a regular chat. His father was at Harvard when he was born. And I hadn't known that, but I think it's interesting. And then Kay's asked her, Kay's is her name, asked her how she felt about people who ask her such rude questions, you know, about my day and stuff. And she said, well, you know, I don't think most people mean to be rude. I think 90% of them, even if they ask oddly, mean to ask because they want to know. And she said, I really don't have time to worry about the other 10%. I met a lot of other people, but I met I can't remember her name now, but the Chinese wife of the Flying Tigers commander one day at the Congressional Wives Club. We happened to sit down on the same couch and got in a chat before our hostesses came for us. You don't just go bursting in there. I worked for the Greenville News. I was woman's editor to the Greenville Piedmont. Then I was on the Charlotte Observer. And I didn't ever work there, but I did a column for the Atlanta Country, the Journal-Constitution on Sunday for a good while, freelance, while I was working for Daddy. And once I taught school 2 different times briefly. The second time, the principal, who was a classmate, I was home because my mother was ill, and he said, I can't offer you a job because I can't pay you enough, but I ask you to fulfill a civic responsibility. I don't think you better print this, but I said, what? He said, I need an English teacher. I've got kids headed for college and they can't pass the SAT English part. I don't mean literature, I mean English. Well, of course, when you write for a living and edit other people's writing, you have to know grammar. So I taught it for a while, and I kind of enjoyed it. But the trouble is, you spend so much time filling out forms and doing this and doing that, that teaching's a little bit too much automatic stuff. But I loved the children. I even went so far as to chaperone a few basketball trips. And it was fun. And we had a meeting first, and we all agreed on what was going to be the rule. And I never had one of them let me down. They all did it. If they said they'd go to bed at midnight, they went to bed at midnight. If they won the whole tournament, I let them stay up till they went to bed, because that was too exciting to, well, nobody's going to go to sleep. After I retired, I stayed in Washington until I had done all the things I wanted to do when I was working and didn't have time to do. I went to all the museums. I went to the symphony. I went to the plays. For those years, I enjoyed the part of Washington that people go to for 2 weeks or whatever. And it was great fun. And I got to see all my friends and play bridge, and it was just a different life, really. And then I decided to sell my condo and come home, or come down. But who was it? Thomas Wolfe said you can't go home again. And in a way that's true. I've been gone 40 years. That means the waters have closed over your head, and you've got to force your way back in, or maybe not force, but maybe not be where people would really like to have you. So I started in Maryland, and I looked at retirement places all the way. And I got to Pawleys Island, and I thought, why would I go anywhere else? So, now, of course, I remember Pawleys when you were on the island, but just the same, it's still special. So I just bought a condo and came. Mostly we worked such long hours that you didn't much go. We'd go with dated agents, son. And yeah, we'd go dancing and that, but the most interesting things at that time to me was things like Roosevelt's funeral. You can't imagine, but you can almost imagine. I had never known a president. I knew the name Herbert Hoover when I was a child, but that's all I knew about any other president than Franklin Roosevelt. And I got to vote for him because I was going to be 21 before the election. Before the year was out. So I voted for him when I was 20. And that's the only time because I wasn't old enough after that. But all those years he'd been the president. And I walked into our condo, which was right near St. Matthew's Cathedral and not too far. I could walk to work. And as we all did, whoever came in first, came in and you flipped the radio on. It was a box thing, you know, and went on in, and I had turned it on, was walking on in, and I heard the announcer say, President Roosevelt is dead. You know, it was just an awful shock because we were used to him running things. And he went on to say that he died at his favorite resting place in Hot Springs, Georgia, and so on. And I remember sitting down and thinking, what does that mean? You know, because it just was very upsetting. And as everybody came in and found out, nobody could imagine. It just was beyond anything. Oh, and I guess I should say what was real interesting. We walked down, we weren't but 6 blocks in a park from the White House. So that night we walked down, and it was the beginning of the United Nations. And all of these people had come through Washington on their way to San Francisco. Well, instead of going on to San Francisco, they stopped here and went to call on Ms. Roosevelt. And in those days, you could go to the White House with a good pass and nobody stopped you. It's almost unbelievable, the difference. But they all, that night, were going into the White House. We were down there watching. And one of the White House chauffeurs was out just kind of looking to see what was going on. And he said, we're in big trouble. And I said, what do you mean? He said, we haven't got enough policemen. And all of us then said, you know, what are you talking about? He said, it's their business if they come to the White House on their own. But it's our business to see that they get home safely. And they called in all the FBI, all the Secret Service, all available OSS, I think, that's pre-CIA, and city policemen, and Virginia and Maryland policemen that they could borrow. Because they had, when the people left, they had to be escorted. And I understand the White House reception room stayed full for a good while because they just had to get people as they came in. And one of the most interesting things, King Eben Seward, now he's the father or grandfather of the present king, was at least 6 or 6.5 feet tall. You know, they wear those long white robes, and you had that big thing with a jewel up there. And he went walking up steps, and he was so graceful looking because you don't see any movement except just that robe going up the steps with a whole lot of other robes on either side of him. And before he got to the top, here came little Haile Selassie, the king of Ethiopia, and his entourage. I think the tallest one was probably 5 feet 6 or 7. And it was just such a contrast and kind of an interesting thing to watch them go up. And I guess there'd never been a collection like that before, because there were people from everywhere, and different costumes, mostly in regular suits, but some all in whatever their native stuff was. And we just sat there, sat there and watched. Stood there. It was just amazing. And the steps were always full, going up for about an hour, I guess. And then it was a good 2 hours and a half before they got everybody out and going. And somebody told me later that Ms. Roosevelt managed to hold up all of it, which I thought was amazing. Because what a blow, goodness. But that was two things that happened. And of course, as I told you about when D-Day was over, I was not there for BJ Day. I was at home. But I understand the city went absolutely bananas. That everybody was out, all but dancing in the street. Because it lasted practically forever, it seemed like. We got in it in 41, didn't we? And didn't get out to 45. And when I look back, I'm so astonished at the British. I was talking to them about that much later when I got to go over there. They'd already had from 39, which wasn't really fighting, but it was in all the way. And they were bombed just horribly. And then they were put under very strict rule. Everything they bought, you had to have coupons for everything. How they did that until they paid their debts, I don't know, but they did it. And I've always been very admiring of that. I've since been in England quite a few times, and it's a very different place now. But they certainly did a remarkable thing. I can't think of another set of people in the world that would be that disciplined. All through the war, the king allowed himself 6 inches, I believe it was, of water in his bath. So it was patriotic for everybody else to limit it to 6 inches. In that, for all those years. I really am very much in admiration of what they made themselves do.